Just waiting. I think a few people are still coming in. So, I mean, it's, Good morning.
Morning.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first hybrid forum of our fall 2022 season. Today, we are both in person and hybrid. I'm Jean Martin. I'm the new chair of the UU Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland Forum Committee. And I'm very grateful to Susan Alcorn, who led the group for many years and established the well-oiled machine that makes my life easier. Susan, could you stand up and can we give her a round of applause? Last summer, when we were planning our forums, I debated what should be the first forum. Should it be Roe, midterm elections, skyrocketing housing prices, and then Uvalde happened. There was no question. We must solve the question, how can we keep our children safe and our loved ones? Today, we have two well-respected speakers who will help us think this through. We'll open up for Q&A at about 9:30, and it will go until 10. For our in-person audience, Debbie will pass around a mic to get your questions. We ask that our virtual audience put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to work them into our program. Please be sure your phones are off or put them in airplane mode. We want to be able to preserve our Wi-Fi, and that also creates interference. This program is being recorded and will be available in a few days on the YouTube channel of our website, uucleveland.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers. On your left is Cleveland area native Brent Larkin. He writes columns for Cleveland.com. For many years after he graduated from Ohio University, he was a political reporter for the Cleveland Press and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, where he also served as editorial director. Brent is one of the best connected people out there. And he says, we're the most intelligent audience he knows. And we love him for it. Senator Matt Dolan is currently serving his second term in the Ohio Senate. He represents portions of Cuyahoga County. He's a partner at Thrasher, Dinsmore, and Dolan. A graduate of Boston College and Case Law School, he was Chief Assistant Prosecutor for Geauga County, Assistant Attorney General for the state of Ohio, and a member of the Ohio House of Representatives. These gentlemen have covered a lot of bases in their lives, and I'm glad to welcome them. Who won the coin toss to speak first?
I'll go. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Brent, for joining us. I appreciate everybody, and I agree. This is probably my fourth time speaking to this group, and I look forward to the question and answers because, as someone, I think it was Gary said, this is an important discussion, and this is what it needs to be, a discussion, particularly in my role, so I can take back thoughts and concerns of residents and bring them and share them with my peers down in Columbus. So the three things I want to discuss before we get into question and answer are the just kind of a 30,000 foot view of the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment. I want to talk about my bill, Senate Bill 357, and then I want to talk a little bit about the politics or the state of play in the legislature now. So if any are constitutional scholars, I apologize ahead of time. I'm going to give a very cursory view, but I want to set up for what the discussion could be about. Obviously, the Second Amendment was part of the Bill of Rights and gave individuals at the time the right to bear arms, the right to form a militia, and that right shall not be infringed. My interpretation of the writings of the Second Amendment over time is that the forefathers strongly were against standing armies at the time, because standing armies usually reflected the will of a monarch, and that was an antithesis to a republican democracy. So when we started, standing armies were not favorable, but obviously people needed to protect themselves from anyone who wanted to take over the government. So the right of self-defense emerged through the right of militia to protect the country. Over time, now I'm fast forwarding to the Heller case, the Supreme Court has then said, okay, that right of self-defense is also an individual right. It's not just to protect ourselves from the country, it's an individual right. Interesting, what in the Heller case, what was also said by Scalia is that not only is the right to bear arms is the right, but it is within the realm of reasonableness to provide regulations upon the Second Amendment, that is not in violation of the Constitution. And it was interesting that Scalia specifically mentioned mental health, that the idea that you need to be of sound mind to be a responsible gun owner. Then Chicago versus Heller, or McDonald versus Chicago came out, and that said, okay, this individual right of self-defense, the right to bear arms, is protected through the 14th Amendment into the states. And so that's why now the Second Amendment the federal Second Amendment is also part of the states. Again, Alito in that decision went on to say, not only do we need to have, you can have reasonable regulations, not only is mental health one of those reasonable regulations, but he went on to say that reasonable regulations on the commercial transactions of firearms is not in violation of the Second Amendment. So when we talk about the Second Amendment a lot, there's obviously a variety of opinions on it, but I approach it from that lens, that view, that it is a right, that it is a right that needs to be protected, but that shall not be infringed, does not deal with reasonable regulations on who and how you get a gun. And then my position always has been, I'll protect your right to own a gun. I'll protect your right to buy a gun. It's when we start talking about the use of the gun that I think we need to be more circumspect about how we look. So in that realm, I drafted Senate Bill 357. And what I tried to do with Senate Bill 357 is recognize what I just said about the Supreme Court and existing law here in Ohio. And there's 3 laws that exist today that are important to know when you read my bill. The first is, in Ohio, we have legal disabilities which prevent you from being able to buy a gun. One of those legal disabilities is if you are suffering from mental illness, mental impairment, or emotional stress. You are not able to buy a gun in Ohio. That is the law, universally accepted, both parties, hasn't been challenged. The number 2 thing is right now in Ohio, that if you're under 21, you cannot buy a handgun. Again, accepted, not challenged. Third is we already have a system in place in which the law says that if someone has not committed a crime, but is experiencing mental illness or mental disturbance, that there is a process to get that person involuntary commitment and help. And that's roughly called the pink slip law. And that is well established in Ohio, what the procedures are in place, how long somebody can be held, and what the medical community needs to do to ultimately get a court to decide this person is suffering from mental illness and needs treatment. All of those 3 things are existing and settled law in Ohio right now. My bill does 5 things. The first thing it does is creates a safety protection order. In the safety protection order, it's very similar to what I worked with Governor DeWine on last time in the Strong Ohio. But last time I worked with mental health groups, with law enforcement, with the gun groups, to make the necessary changes, which of course satisfies all three of them. Only one of the three now, of course, is agreeing to these changes. But what this bill does in a nutshell is says, okay, if we accept that if mental illness is a reason you can't buy a gun, why don't we accept that if that mental illness occurs after you purchase a gun, then you should be separated from your firearms until you are sound mind again. But I go a step further, maybe one more layer of protection. Once a court determines somebody's mentally ill, right now that's where it ends. Then they do the involuntary, whether it's outpatient, inpatient. My bill says at that moment in time, the prosecutor can make a motion to have a safety protection order issued, which says that two things. It says there is evidence that this individual is either suicidal or homicidal, and there's probable cause that this person has access to their firearms. And if the prosecutor proves that case with the individual in the courtroom, with a lawyer if they choose, subject to cross-examination, they put their own witnesses, so the full due process, then the law enforcement, if the order is issued, would have 12 hours to go into the home without the individual present to remove the firearms, and it lays out how they're supposed to store them and how the gentleman gets it back or individual gets it back. Number two is it deals with the purchase between 18 and under 21. My bill would say only a single shot rifle can be purchased straight up. Any other firearm would need a 25-year-old or older to co-sign, and that co-signer is subject to civil liability if that gun that's purchased by that individual is used or brandished in a felony crime before that person turns 21. This bill is in direct response, or this portion of the bill is in direct response to Uvalde, when you had a young man at 18 go in and buy a gun on his 18th birthday and used it 5 days later to kill children. So recognizing, which we're going to get to in a second, but recognizing at 18, you don't have a background check because your juvenile records are not subject to the background check. So it's recognizing that you may your record may not be available for someone to determine whether you're able to have a gun. And let's face it, not all 18 to 21-year-olds are mature mentally and emotionally to have the responsibility to be a responsible gun owner. There is an exception if you are in law enforcement and if you are in the military, then you don't have to comply with this. But as you'll hear from law enforcement and military, as this bill progresses, we don't just hand out guns to just anybody. We make sure that they're of sound mind and body. We make sure that they're trained before they have a firearm. So it's not as if anyone gets a gun as soon as they go into law enforcement. The third is a seller protection certificate, which I know is not universal background check, but real quick, federal law, if you're a federally licensed firearm dealer, you have to perform a background check on an individual. Otherwise, if you are just a private seller, you do not. But it is current law today that if you are a private seller and you sell a firearm to somebody who has one of the legal disabilities, you are civilly liable right now. My bill says, okay, if you are a private dealer and you question the validity of your buyer, then you can ask them to get a seller protection certificate, which goes to the sheriffs, and you get a background check. You present the certificate to the seller, and what that does is provide immunity to the seller that if in fact that person suffers from disabilities, there's no civil liability on the seller. The fourth is to make sure that our orders from our courts get into the system as soon as possible, and that is into the LEAD system, into BCIS system, because what's happening today is, let's use a domestic dispute. If a couple goes into a court, or one spouse goes into the court and says, my other spouse is violent towards me, I want a protection order. Well, in Ohio today, you can get that ex parte, which means without the other side being present. In Ohio today, if that court believes that that spouse is indeed violent and is a threat, the court can order those guns removed from that person without any hearing. My bill simply just says, look, if that order is issued, it's got to be in the system by the end of the next business day. Because we want any disability background check to be up to date. And the fifth is that it provides appropriations. It is $85 million that would go towards working with higher ed, Department of Mental Health, and the Adams boards around the state. We want to make sure that we create a system to have more mental health workers available. Get them trained, get them licensed, get them into the schools, get them into the clinics, get them into the government, so that we recognize we have a mental health crisis. Let's make sure we have mental health workers to deal with it. And the second appropriation is creating regional mental health crisis centers around the state. We're hoping to have 6 of them. And what this would do is make sure that somebody, again, we have more workers, we have a place for people who are suffering from mental health to go. If you talk to sheriffs around the state, they'll tell you that 20% of their population is people who are suffering from mental health, need the help, but the jailers are not trained for that. So to get people, A, to have a place for people to go if they're picked up, part of the pink slip, and B, to make sure that we provide an opportunity to keep people out of jails who shouldn't be there and have them get the help that they need. And then finally, what's the state of play in Columbus? Well, I will tell you out front that the gun lobbying groups have an outsized influence on our caucus, both in the House and the Senate. So that is, I agree with that. I accept that. Having said that, though, Ohio is an extremely diverse state. And when we start talking about guns in the Ohio legislature, one of the things that people always say to me, well, you need to listen to your constituents. And I think I do. But there are other places in the state where when you start talking about gun laws, what they start hearing is you're taking my ability to protect me and my family away from them. Because I live in Chagrin Falls. If I call 911, 911 is going to be there 2 to 5 minutes. If you live in Henry County and you call 911, it might not be there for 30, 35 minutes. So the whether it's ever going to be a reason to confront it or not, there is a reasonable position from some residents in Ohio that this right of bear arms is a right of self-defense, and I can't rely on the local law enforcement because they may not be there in time, and I want to protect my family. And choosing which weapon I want to represent my family with is a right that they enjoy. And that's why there's a big push against when you start talking about banning a particular gun. They're like, well, look, I have a right of self-defense. It's pretty clear in the Supreme Court. How I choose to defend my house, my family, is protected by the Second Amendment. So when we have a discussion that that routinely comes up, my goal is this: is that and I met with big city mayors this week, and I told them this bill will have very little to do with protecting your cities, changing the violence in your cities, particularly gun violence. This bill will have little impact on that. And I make no bones to say that this will change it. I actually think this bill is relatively milquetoast. But whenever one of these tragic events happen, there seems to be unity around the fact that this is happening because of mental illness. And what I want to be able to say is mental illness sometimes expresses itself in suicidal or homicidal behavior. And that's why it's important to recognize that this bill isn't designed to say if you're suffering from mental illness, therefore all your guns get taken away from you. It has to be that second component, that's you're suicidal and homicidal. And so let's recognize that public safety, I'm getting the hook. Public safety, mental illness, and responsible gun ownership is a conversation that this state can have. And I believe that my bill addresses all three of those, protects the Second Amendment, and maybe is a step towards preventing one of these horrible tragedies from occurring. So that's my motivation. I will cede the table to Brent.
When I first agreed to come back here for about the fourth or fifth time. And I told Gene that I'm not here to debate Matt. Matt's actually had enough debates for the years. With JD Vance and Josh Mandel and Gibbons and a couple other guys who were really interesting. So
Nice way to put it.
yeah, this is not a debate, but I'm gonna start by beginning like a debater and ask, where is the gun lobby on the bill? Because I honestly don't know.
Oh, there he goes.
So now, and he's acknowledged the problem with that. And history tells us that Matt's bill will not become law in Ohio. That's what history tells us. Because we are in the process of this 20-year rearming of America, and it's being done mostly at the state legislative level. The Congress dabbles in it occasionally, but state and Ohio is in the last 2 years, or when was the constitutional carry bill passed? This year or last year?
Just this
And Ohio has gone all in on the idea of arming America with very few restrictions. And Mike DeWine is a perfect example of what can happen to an elected official who has a very long record, a lot of positives in Mike DeWine's, 40-year record in elected life. And I believe it's at least 3 times he has voted for an assault weapons ban, which are the primary source of the slaughter of children in their schools across America, and for an assault style weapons ban. And he's kind of been all over it. In more recent years, he was all over a lot on the gun issue. And then came Dayton in August of 2019. Thank you. And 6 or 7 people were killed, 16 or 17, more than a dozen people were injured. And DeWine and his wife, and if you've seen the video, I'm sure you have, went to Dayton, hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the street there, and they chanted, "Do something." And DeWine and Mike and Fran DeWine, they appeared genuinely moved that night. He said, "We love you, we hear you, and we will not forget you, and we will try and help you." And he did for a little while. He introduced a bill that the details of which I'm sure Matt is much more familiar than I am. It was some modest measures that may have helped on the margins. But he never used his bully pulpit with the legislature to get the bill passed. The gun lobby opposed it, and it went nowhere. And then 2 years later, the governor did an entire flip-flop on the issue, and he signed the constitutional carry bill. And I've written this, and this governor who once got consistent F grades from the gun lobby became the class valedictorian for the gun crowd in Ohio. And if you're going to have a hard time moving Mike DeWine, for better or worse, Mike DeWine is a centrist in today's Republican Party. You have to understand the context that I put that in. He is a centrist, as is Matt Dolan. And I just, the evidence on this, again, to return to my rearming of America, the arming of America, for it has become a killing field for children. It is no other developed nation on earth has the mass shootings that this one does. I think, but for Brazil, we are at the top of the list in gun deaths almost consistently, almost every year. And I think what we have to figure out a way to take assault style weapons off the street and out of people's hands. And even then it would take perhaps years to notice a difference, because once I own one of those weapons, you can't expect a successful movement to go fetch them and take them back. But you have to start somewhere. And Matt is walking a very fine line with his party here, and it's a tough problem, and I've become kind of an extremist on the gun issue over the years, and I think gun groups should perhaps start thinking about putting this, putting this issue on the ballot in states across America and seeing what happens. Doing it on a state-by-state basis might not be all that workable, because you could cross over, you can go to West Virginia and buy a gun because they're not going to ban them. But I just don't, I think the slaughter of children in their classrooms is going to continue and I see no hope of that changing in the near future. So that's my happy viewpoint of it. We're perfect. It's 9:30 now.
Thank you, Matt and Brent. You've given us a lot to think about. You, the audience, if you have strong feelings on either side of the issue, I hope that you will use your best and only weapon, and that's your vote. The election is November 8th. That's a very good way to express it. And if you're not registered already, although I suspect most everybody here is registered, we have voter registration forms at the round table at the back. I'll now turn the Q&A over to Debbie, who should pass around the mic, and also a clipboard. If you're not on our email list, please sign up for either forum emails or church emails. Thank you.
I'm waiting for someone to ask a question.
Debbie has a mic, please.
Okay, Pat. Thanks so much for being here. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay. In addition to each of us voting, it's so important for us to get everybody to vote. Our voting level is so low nationwide, but in Ohio, in Cuyahoga County. Get our friends out, get our neighbors out, get all our family out, and work for getting people to the polls. There's so many ways that you can reach people. There are many organizations who are writing letters, postcards. I just encourage everybody to don't give up. Let's keep working at this. Question? No question. Anybody have a question?
Yes. Hi, thank you, Matt. I appreciate very much that you're walking a very narrow path and trying to come up with a viable solution. Two things that come to mind out of the many. Dealers. I didn't hear you speak much about how we address dealers selling.
Non-federally licensed dealers? Because if you're a federally licensed gun store, you are subject to a lot of different laws than you are if you are a private dealer. You're not subject to requirements for background check. So I'm trying to deal with that by going after the seller protection certificate, is to, first of all, remind people that if you do sell a gun to someone with legal disability, it is a crime today. And if you want to be immune from that possibility, require your buyer to go prove that they don't have any of the legal disabilities. It's not a universal background check, which I'm sure most of the folks here want. But the reality is I think this is a balance. You know, a lot of times I hear from the Republican side, why don't we just enforce the laws that we have today? I'm like, we should. And if you sell a gun to somebody with legal disability, you should be prosecuted. And people don't even realize that that's a possibility. So the more people recognize that they're subjecting themselves to perhaps criminal behavior, maybe they'll be inspired to get more background checks.
Hi, speaking as a physician, I would only bring up the point that I think using the mental illness issue is fallacious. There are just as many crazy people in Japan per capita as there are in the United States. And in Japan, they kill 1 or 2 people a year. The problem is guns. Mental disorders are going to continue unchanged. They've been there since the Constitution was first formed. And they will continue to be. The only way you're going to handle this, as Mr. Larkin says, is reduce access to guns. And of course, the argument that you bring up about protecting yourself and having a gun has been proven over and over again. You usually end up shooting your wife or one of your kids. And studies that show where people are using guns to defend themselves, most of the time it's not well handled. So the issue is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment dealt with muzzle-loaded weapons. And now that we have breech-loaded weapons and automatic weapons, the only thing that's going to change us and take us off the black mark that we hold as a country, where we're killing 30,000, 40,000 people a year, and Japan is killing, what, a handful a year, is to change the gun law. You don't have to be smart.
So just a brief comment there. So I work with mental health groups in drafting this bill. So your premise, the one thing I did not want to have this bill be is if you're mentally ill, therefore your rights are being taken away from you. There has to be that showing of suicidal or homicidal behavior in addition to any mental illness. And again, we recognize already mental illness is a reason you should not have a gun. What does it matter when the mental illness occurs?
It's defining mental health.
Right, yeah, depression.
We do, the bill does that.
Thank you both for being here today. Mr. Dolan, you said that there was a minimum age that someone had to be in order to buy a handgun. What about other types of guns? And what kinds of guns, can you differentiate between a handgun and other guns?
So the current law today is if you're under 21, you cannot purchase a handgun. There are no other prohibitions on any other gun. My bill would say that you can't, other than a single shot, you can't buy any gun unless you have a 25-year-old co-sign with you, and that person is subject to liability for the use of that gun.
What exactly is a handgun?
I'm not a gun expert. I don't know what the legal definition, but there's rifle, which is long barreled, and handgun, which is short barreled.
What about a semi-automatic? Where does that fall?
I think that is a type of gun. I think you can have a semi-automatic handgun or a semi-automatic rifle. I think that allows you to pull a trigger without having to reload in between. An automatic would be you can hold the trigger down. Semi-automatic is you don't have to, like a rifle, sometimes you have to reload is, yeah.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you to both of you for being here, and Senator Dolan, I certainly recognize the precarious position that you're in right now. And I'm very grateful that you're opening the door for this conversation. I wanted to ask two questions. One is, could you address the terrorism piece that you put into this bill, as well as talk a little bit about permitless carry? We know that, that passed. You had voted for it. We know from data that that is going to increase gun violence in our state. States across the country that have that bill, that have had that pass, show dramatic increases in gun violence. So I just wanted to see if you could talk about that a little bit as well.
So the first piece on it, there is a piece on terrorism because we touch a bit of federal law, and I touched that piece of federal law without the terrorism part, and LSC came in, he says, you can't make changes. You can't, the terrorism piece has to be in there, but it really does not have any applicability. If someone is mentally ill and they wanted to commit, quote, a terrorist act, they still have to have there still has to be evidence of it. So that is really a drafting issue more than any, I'm not trying to change any terrorist law. I did vote for the permitless carry for two reasons. One is we are an open carry state and have been. And so the discrepancy in how an individual would follow the law bothered me a little bit. The other reason is, and we all talk about it, boy, I wish we could have more compromise. Well, the as introduced version had two provisions that I could not live with. And I got them out. One was that you would now have civil immunity for the use of the gun. And we got that out. And the second was that you no longer had to inform a police officer that you're carrying. And I got that out. And if you're going to compromise and you're going to have a legislation that works, you can't turn around and then say, well, thanks for working with me to get my bill out, but I'm not going to vote for it anymore. So the inconsistency in the application of the law and the removal of those two items made me comfortable voting for the bill.
I'm a retired psychologist. I tend to agree with what the retired physician said. Even if we had enough mental health people to staff the centers that you're talking about, it would take years. It's guns. It's not mental health. And when I was in second grade and we were hiding under our desks in preparation for the next nuclear war, I was in second grade and we all knew that duck and cover was ridiculous. Just like we know what's going on in our schools about teaching them what to do when the armed shooter and the active shooter drills are going on. Just like kids know they're scared and they don't want to go to school. School refusals are up. Kids are acting out. Behavior is out of control. It's about guns. There's no reasonable person that would say individuals in this country need to own assault rifles. And that's the place to start. When things are this out of control, you can't walk a fine line. You need to make a choice. You can't be in the middle. This country's divided and you need to take a stand. And one of the stands is we will not tolerate this violence and we will not tolerate individuals owning assault weapons.
I'm going to ask some questions this time. If I was a fly on the wall at the Republican caucuses where you're discussing these laws and shaping them, getting ready to create whatever it is we vote on, or you vote on, not us, we vote on at the legislative level, how divided, how many people in the Republican Party actually are a little uncomfortable with how free we have access to guns in the state with concealed carry, open carry, no background checks, no registrations. We even know how many guns we have. Would there be enough people who would maybe not block what Brent Larkin's talking about in terms of having a referendum in the state that crosses party lines instead of keeping it at party line votes? Do you have enough Republicans that actually allow something like that to come to vote?
Well, so Brett and I agreed that this is perhaps a road game for me here. But a couple things there. One is I did recently run for the Republican nomination for US Senate. And I got a chance to go around the entire state and speak to lots of groups, most of them Republicans. I didn't shy away from this bill. I talked about why we needed to do something like this. And I didn't convince everyone, but I think that we started realizing there is some reasonable positions we could take. The comments we just heard, you have to understand that there are legislators around the state who go to groups just like this, and they hear the complete opposite. So they come to Columbus armed with the idea that I can't do anything with guns because my constituents don't want anything done. And in fact, my bill, the ink wasn't even dry on my bill, and Senator Yuko, minority leader in the Senate, came out against it. He hadn't even a chance to read it, and he came out against it. So there is polarization. It is both sides. I think in the makeup of this particular caucus, I think it's going to be difficult. I think more people tend to. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, though, of the interpretation of the Second Amendment inside my caucus. And the more I have a chance to meet with folks one-on-one and explain to them that conservative justice have said mental illness is something we need to look at, reasonable commercial transaction of guns is something we can look at. That's hopefully the melting of the ice to get something done.
So you really didn't answer the question about, do you think a referendum statewide on guns that took it outside of party affiliations would be allowed to pass?
Tell me what the referendum says.
Well, right, that does make a difference. Because it's the same thing with abortion rights, right?
Brent, you look like you want to say something. I don't want to leave you out.
Kind of. I was going to answer the question for Matt. Matt's in a very small minority in his caucus. That's a kind of. And Matt was a Democrat at one point. Am I right? See? And I believe he was an elected official he was elected as a Democrat. No, okay, but you ran for state rep or something, didn't it? But he was a Democrat.
Yeah. Why did you change?
We're talking 35 years ago. I just didn't think the Democratic Party I thought they were changing to a point where I wasn't comfortable.
I have never been an especially partisan person, but that change, my politics changed beginning in 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. Things don't have to draw a map about what happened, or describe what happened in this country. But Ohio is now not a hopelessly red state, but a decidedly red state. And in the interest of disclosure, I'm not Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, but of the money I give to nonprofits, more of it goes to a group called Sandy Hook Promise than any other place where my money goes. And we have, and here's why I'm talking about Sandy Hook. We have in Ohio now a nominee for the United States Senate who I think has probably about a 52% chance of winning. I just pulled that number out of my head. Who has embraced Alex Jones and essentially described him as a truth teller. And complained that the regime is out to get him. And this is a guy he's defending who has said that those 20 children in those classrooms at Sandy Hook were not slaughtered and that it didn't happen. So with guys like that at the top of the ticket in Ohio, I write off the Republican Party and I make no apology for it.
I would add, sir, that same Senate candidate has also said that women should remain in violent
Oh, he
marriages.
said a lot of things. Yes, he said he doesn't give a damn about the Ukraine. What happens to the people?
And I'm afraid Mr. Dolan has vocally endorsed him. But actually, Mr. Larkin, I have to take an issue with something that you said. You called yourself an extremist on the gun issue. You are
Okay.
not an extremist, sir.
Okay.
You are in the vast majority. The vast majority of Ohioans want gun sense, common sense gun legislation. The extremists sit on our General Assembly.
Okay.
Amen.
And they sit here, sir, because of the extreme gerrymandering in our state. So Senator Dolan on a call with Moms Demand Action, probably a year, maybe 18 months ago, we asked actually where you sat on this particular issue on gerrymandering, because while I sincerely believe, sir, that you do want to see common sense gun measures, I do believe that you have a sincere interest in doing that and trying to make Ohio states safer. I also know that this bill and any bill you have introduced has 0% chance of passing our extremist legislature. And on that call, we asked you what you plan to do about the gerrymandering issue and fair districts. And you said, oh, that's a good issue. Your group should really get involved in that, which we did. To see our legislature and our governor and our secretary of state, among others, completely ignore the Ohio Constitution, and again, completely ignore the vast majority of Ohioans who want common sense government, common sense laws, common sense legislation. So, sir, when you put forth these bills, knowing they have no chance of going anywhere, and you continue to ignore the root cause of the issue, gerrymandering, extreme, districts that do not accurately represent the majority of Ohioans. I do not question your sincerity in trying to pass gun bills. I guess I question your methodology.
I'm not sure what my methodology is. Look,
Ignoring gerrymandering, not coming out.
So this is not gonna be a-
about it.
Republicans made a lot of mistakes. But I can tell you my view of what happened, because on the state side, we don't play a role. On the federal side, we do. Both sides have politicized this issue. Both
Sorry,
sides.
this is not a both sides issue, sir.
Yeah, look, this isn't what, we can go through those Supreme Court cases and match up what the majority said matches up to where in the law. Look, I'm not saying Republicans did great. I think there could have been, in the initial vote, could have changed all of this if someone voted a different way. But I'm not willing to say that there was politicizing both sides in this, and it's shameful. But I'm pretty straightforward, so I wouldn't say that if I didn't believe that the Democrat, and I have some inside information about what they were thinking, and it's all political.
Hi, Senator Dolan. Thank you so much for not ignoring the issue of gun violence. I'm a constituent. We've talked a number of times. First of all, this is kind of off topic, but this is like civil procedure, and you brought it up. So 30 some years ago, the Democrats changed, but they just take a look around now at your party, and I think they're changing just a bit. But anyway, so what I wanted to say was really, as I say, I appreciate your efforts in this. I think you mentioned responsible gun ownership, and I just think that it's hard to talk about responsible gun ownership in a state that just passed permitless carry and arming teachers and such. What I would like you to tell your Republican colleagues is that here at Moms Demand Action, we're not gun grabbers. They don't want to listen to us at all. And I know I've talked to you about this. I mean, we could have 100 or more testimonies against these horrible gun bills, and they get a handful for them, and right in front of our faces, they pass it out committee while we're there in person. So they don't listen to us. They take the position as soon as they see our red shirts that we're there to ban all weapons, and that is not what we're trying to do. But we can't work with them if they're starting from that position. So if you could, as that bridge, help us get some of maybe the more reasonable ones, as somebody brought up before, if they exist. Just to understand where we're coming from. We want sensible gun laws, and we've already gone so far in the opposite direction in the last couple of years in Ohio. So again, as a constituent, thank you for ignoring this.
Well, so where do you stand on 357, my bill?
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's pieces of it that even Moms Demand Action supports. So I individually am probably more supportive of it than the organization, so.
Well, but I appreciate that, but that's the point. I happen to disagree with that you have to take a side in this. I think this is an issue, just what you're saying. I mean, think about what you just said. The group that's most known for being, quote, anti-gun is now saying, we're not anti-gun. So you're taking you're most known for it, because she even said that. I mean, that's Moms Demand Action and the Republican caucus is I think, accurately described that their ultimate goal is to ban weapons. That would be the perception of the Republican caucus has in you. What we just heard, though, is the middle ground. No. We're not trying to ban guns. We want reasonableness. So that's why I disagree with what you said. This can't. If you're going to say it's one issue or the other, nothing ever.
Assault rifle.
ever. Well, it all goes together. It all goes together.
Why?
Because what is reasonable to one is not always unreasonable to another.
We have a couple of online questions that I'd like to get to. So when you're using the mic in person, would you frame your comments in the form of a question, not comments?
I missed most of the speech. I apologize, and I'm like everybody else, so glad you're here.
Can't hear
I read on the internet an interesting item just the other day, a breakout on a receipt for gun purchases like we have with drugs, food items, that would help in tracing and all sorts of things. Do we have a chance of getting that in Ohio, or is it federal? I'm just not up to date on it. Do you understand my question? When you use a credit card or whatever, it breaks out a gun purchase? I think she's talking about a registry of who owns guns, and I think that's against the law, right?
I mean, current makeup, there's not a chance there'll be a gun registry.
So one of the questions online is, do either of you own guns?
I do not.
I have never fired a gun. I wouldn't know, I'd shoot myself. I have no idea.
Okay. I think we've actually covered the other ones. Are there any more in-person questions? One up front here.
Thank you for being here. I would ask you, turn it this way. I would ask you a question about the Second Amendment. It clearly states that this is for a militia. This was done back in some years ago. Things have changed since then. We do have standing armies. We have local police. We have state police. We have National Guard. We have all kinds of units that now are here to help us police issues. So how can we say that in these times, we now need to have standing militias who have assault weapons and that everyone needs to have an assault weapon? The Constitution should be a dynamic article, and it needs to change through time. And since we now have all these issues of standing armies and police and so forth, now we still need to say it's okay for people to have assault weapons and we need to have militias out there.
Well, as I said in my open remarks, I mean, I'm trying to use the conservative view of the Second Amendment as a reason why this bill couldn't go forward. That is not in violation. And I have open remarks. If you're a constitutional scholar, you may have a different interpretation of those court cases. You may like the dissenting opinions more. But in the context of the Second Amendment, it has been clear through conservative viewpoints that it is self-defense was a motivation. It still exists today. It is an individual right, but it can have reasonable regulations, restrictions placed upon us. So that's how I'm using the Second Amendment.
Reasonable regulations.
Well, and look, I mean, we have right of free speech, but we now have the internet, we have all of this thing, so, we gotta be careful how we just automatically just change things because of time.
Last question?
Hi, I just want to mention the word culture. I spent part of my childhood years in West Virginia in mining towns where the mines closed down on the first day of hunting season because nobody would show up for work. That's the deer and so forth were food. So it was part of the culture, and that was the way it was in those days, way back. But what I see now culturally is the spread of violence in our movies, for example. Look at what children and everyone is exposed to all the time. They're fed guns and violence as part of our culture. If you contrast that with England, for example, and Queen Elizabeth's death, I was amazed at how the monarchy would shake people's hands without any kind of protection. They were out there. There was no worry about someone being shot, when they were riding around in the car waving or something. So it is part of our culture, and it's very difficult to change a culture because we're fed it and renewed it every time we turn on if we go to a movie or whatever. So I just want to mention that as background information, not for any answer or anything, but just to recognize it's hard to change a culture, and we're in the middle of it, and it's still growing.
I want to thank everybody for coming, our speakers, our audience here, our audience virtually, and our tech people who made this hybrid session happen. It's been a job, and I think it's been successful. Next week's forum is post-Roe impact and options. The speakers will be Dr. Ardash Krishan. He's the Chief Medical Officer from Planned Parenthood of Ohio, and Mary Schatzman, one of our congregants who's an RN with the Northeast Ohio Women's Center, an abortion clinic. You're welcome to attend our 10:15 Sunday service upstairs in the sanctuary or on YouTube. Today's theme is the opposite of fitting in, and the music will include the post-COVID return of our youth choir. I, for one, am very excited to see them. So to see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website, uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week.